Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are IEN consultants, and in our first series of podcasts, we will be touching base on the key climate highlights which will be covered during the COP26, taking place later this week in Glasgow between October 31st and November 12, 2021. COP26, or the 26th Conference of Parties, is a gathering of world leaders from UN member states which aims to accelerate action towards meeting the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. The agreement, which is a legally binding international treaty, was signed by 192 countries in 2016 and has a long-term goal to limit the rise in global temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and to pursue means necessary to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. To achieve this long-term goal, each participating countries had been required to prepare a nationally determined contribution, otherwise known as NDCs. These NDCs outline the efforts taken by each country to reduce their GHG emissions. As a participating member state, Malaysia has released its first NDC in 2016, which stated our commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions intensity of GDP by 45% by 2030 relative to the emissions intensity of GDP in 2005. As part of the Paris Agreement, a 5-year review of the NDCs was actually due in 2020. However, due to COVID delays, the review had been postponed to 2021. For the purpose of this review, all participating member states have submitted a revised NDC, including Malaysia. In our first podcast series, we will look at the key climate highlights of the Malaysian revised NDC, which will be shared by my colleague Yamona Segar. And then we will also hear the opinions of Gregers Reimann and Regina Ng as they weigh in on the progress and policy decisions of the NDCs by Denmark and Singapore. It's important to note that all the items that will be discussed here are our personal views only. So we will get started with today's episode as we zoom in on the key update in the Malaysia NDC, which states Malaysia's intention to reduce its economy-wide carbon intensity of 45% in 2030 compared to 2005. Yamona will share with us what this target means, how it differs from the initial NDC set in 2015, and what does this projection mean to our economy. Here's Yamona Segar.
Thanks, Sheena. So, as we all are aware, COP26 is about to happen at the end of this month. So, our Prime Minister, Dato Seri Ismail Sabri Yaakob, has reiterated our country's commitment to reduce our greenhouse gas intensity per GDP by 45% by 2030. And that is relative to our 2005 baseline. And he further added that this commitment was made unconditionally and is 10% lower than our previous commitment. So, if we look at our historic CO2 emissions per GDP, it did decline by 32% from 2005 to 2018. That means our carbon emissions per unit of income has declined over the past decade. Now, that sounds great, right? Except it's not. So when we look more closely, our country's overall carbon emission has actually increased by 31% from 2005, the base year, to 2018. And because we were measuring our emission using an intensity target, which is normalized to account for economic growth, it appeared as though our emissions has decreased. So many were not aware of this, and with the headlines being made that our emission intensity will be reduced by 45%, actually excited a lot of people. They were very hopeful that, our carbon emissions are reducing, but in actual fact, it is not, right? So the very structure of this emission intensity ratio is problematic because when the economy is growing faster than our emission, it's going to appear as though our CO2 emission is decreasing, right? Because as a developing nation, our economy is supposed to grow. It has to grow, right? So when that is about to happen, it's going to overstate or understate our CO2 emissions. And if we are using this CO2 intensity as a metric to form policies or plans, that is going to be misleading. And the bottom line is that Malaysia has been contributing more to climate change now than it ever was. And we are not talking about that, right? And with us setting our carbon intensity at 45% reduction, right? we are actually, in fact, doubling our overall carbon emissions, and this is nothing different than, business as usual. So yeah, and if anyone is interested, if anyone is interested in knowing more, you can check out the article that was published in our IEN website on the 24th of October, titled "The Worst Way to Measure Emission Reduction."
Thanks, Yamona. Just curious. So what you're saying is that what you've mentioned is that our current commitment is problematic in that our GDP growth and carbon emissions are going to rise simultaneously, meaning that we are not actually going to be seeing an absolute reduction in emissions. But is this something that developing countries generally, the problem that we have, is this something that you think is due to a funding problem, and are there other developing countries that are following the same sort of projection in their NDCs?
Yeah, actually, so what happens is developed nations, they are already developed, right? And their GDP is kind of stable, right? But developing nations, our GDP is expected to rise, our economy is expected to grow over the time. So many developing nations, they use this metric as to measure their CO2 emissions. And even if we look closely at other countries, the emissions are still rising, right? And there hasn't been significant reduction in CO2, in the overall CO2. So,
and if you take countries like China and India, for example, China and India has also been using the CO2 emission intensity to measure their CO2 emissions. And China alone, their emission intensity has decreased by 71.8%, but their overall emission has increased by 72%. And even India, their intensity has increased by 48%, but overall has increased by 71%. So I think many developing countries are also facing these issues.
And how does this, in your opinion, how does this weigh in on the goal, which is to reduce the emissions to, the global temperatures to below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels?
See, the root cause of climate change is the increasing CO2 in the atmosphere. So, and that is why many countries have set targets to reduce their CO2, and that is how NDC came about. But even if all the countries are committed to achieving their NDCs, the recent report that was released by NDC, it's called the Ndc Synthesis Report, concludes that, even if all of them have achieved their targets, our global greenhouse gas emissions will only reduce by 1% by 2030. But IPCC recommends that we need to have a 45% reduction target in order to stay within our 1.5 degrees Celsius. And if you can see there is a huge gap, 1% and 45%. So that means that we are not doing enough, right? And we have to set stricter emissions target, and it's not just about setting targets also, right? At the end of the day, we also have to work towards achieving those targets. Yeah.
Definitely. Thank you very much. I think that gives us a good idea of the Malaysia targets, and I think gives us a good idea that we're not doing good enough or what's necessary to achieve the goals. And I think that involves a lot of developing countries and the issues that we are having, which brings us to what the developed countries are doing. So we'll move on to Gregers as he shares us his opinion on what it means to have an absolute emissions target and what is Denmark doing as a developed country towards achieving the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm from Denmark, and I basically grew up with quite a high sort of awareness on environmental issues. I'm 46 years old, and the year I was born, we had the energy crisis in Europe, and we basically kept focusing on energy efficiency and pushing that as a sort of natural thing. So in the developed sort of developed world, you could say, like Europe, we have basically agreed that since we are fairly developed and we realize we have to do something, we are talking about absolute CO2 reductions and not this intensity. And this is also what's needed because, as Yamona just mentioned, we need this overall reduction in CO2 in absolute terms. So Denmark, like the rest of the European Union members, have submitted this joint NDC that requires an overall 40% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2030. And Denmark is on track to reach that. I can also mention the base year in this case is actually going back to 1990. So it's not the more recent year of 2005 like Malaysia. But on top of that, Denmark is also has enacted a climate law. And this came as a consequence of popular demand. So there was a sort of citizens' movement and vote, 2019 I think it was. And once you get a certain amount of signatures, the parliament basically has to vote on this kind of legislation. So it went to the parliament, and 8 out of 9 parties joined this agreement to form a climate law in Denmark, and this is binding. So that means every year the Minister of Climate has to face the Parliament and account for how it's going. And we don't just have to take his word for it. There's a climate council, which is an independent council of experts that will basically independently review and assess how Denmark is doing. And the Danish target is to, by 2030, to achieve 70% reductions. Somewhat higher than the European one, 40. So Denmark has committed to 70% greenhouse gas emission reductions by 2030. And it's quite interesting to follow this because the government is actually also scrambling to make this happen. It's not easy. And in the first assessment report, which was earlier this year, this independent climate council basically said, you are getting an F. You are talking that you're going to do this and this and this, but there's no certainty that you will actually be able to achieve the 70%. So now the government then has to come back and say, okay, we really have to get these agreements and policies in place and get back on track, because the main criticism was that some of these reductions were coming from, let's say, carbon capture from the atmosphere, this kind of technologies that are not really economical or maybe not technically feasible. So it's like a little bit guesswork whether that's actually going to materialize. So that's the sort of outlook from Denmark and from Europe, where it's quite serious business and much more, I would say, in focus in the national conversation than here in Malaysia. For example, the last elections in Denmark, it was all about climate change. That was the main issue, and those parties that didn't have a firm position on this lost.
Mm. In your opinion, Yamona, just coming back to Malaysia for a little bit, do you think that there has been quite a conversation surrounding the COP26 as we inch closer to it?
Yeah, I think there certainly is a lot of conversations that has been happening around Malaysia. I've been seeing a lot of, COP26 making headlines in the newspapers, and people are actually talking about it, and they want to know what will Malaysia be doing next, and how are we going to achieve this 45% reduction intensity and not absolute emissions. But yeah, there has been conversations going on.
Right. Okay, now we come a little bit closer to home and we hear from Regina. So Regina, Singapore's NDC is an economy-wide absolute GHG emissions limitation target. So what exactly does this mean? How does it impact the economic growth of Singapore? And is the absolute GHG emissions target any different from their previous commitment?
Okay, so Singapore's original pledge was actually to reduce the GHG emission intensity by 36% by 2030 compared to the 2005 baseline. So it was like what Yamona has discussed previously. It's emission over the GDP. But Singapore has since updated the NDC in March 2020 to formalize its NDC to an absolute emission target of 65 million ton carbon emission equivalent. So this is a positive step because it does set a concrete level of emission to be met. It's more transparent and it does not depend on a fluid factor such as the GDP because as we know the Earth's ecosystem and the climate does not care about your GDP.
GDP, correct.
Yeah. So this is a good step forward. The problem is, upon closer examination, we will see that this emission target is actually 28% higher than the 2014 emission level. And as what Yamona and Gregers mentioned just now, IPCC has recommended that we need a global reduction of at least 45% in emission to even have a chance of us meeting the Paris Agreement of 1.5 degrees. So targeting an absolute emission that is still 28% higher than the 2014 emission does not really make me believe that this climate target is ambitious enough for us to meet our commitment. And the climate action tracker actually mentions that if all countries were to follow our policies in Singapore, we will only be able to meet a temperature increase of 3 degrees and not 1.5. So that is definitely below our commitment.
And how does this impact the economic growth in Singapore? Is there some decisions that have been made? I mean, you've said that it is higher than the 2014 emissions, is that right? So if it's higher than 2014, is there any economic reason to this? And is there a problem with funding, or what are the challenges that Singapore is facing to up their emissions reduction?
I think that for Singapore it's quite unique because we are a city-state, we are very small, we have a high population density, and we also have limited access to alternative renewable energy. But one thing that Singapore has actually done to try to achieve this is to collaborate with other countries. As you know, Singapore depends almost 95% on natural gas, which is cleaner than coal, but of course it's still not good enough. So now Singapore and Australia, we have signed a deal and the works are already underway to have the world's first intercontinental power grid, which is the Australia-Asia Power Link project. This will help to supply around 20% of Singapore's electricity from the solar farm that is located in Australia. And that will span for 4,500 kilometers from Australia to bring power to Singapore. There's also been a recent memorandum signed by a French company and a Singapore power company to build and to obtain solar energy from Indonesia. So I think that in terms of the challenges, it is valid that we do have a limited access and we have a limit of land, but we are all in this together and it's a global problem. So what we can do is to collaborate with our neighbours to help to resolve all these challenges that we might face.
Great, thanks Regina. I think that's a great way to wrap up this session, is to highlight the importance of collaboration between nations, because climate change is after all a global challenge that we're all facing, and we don't have time to sit back and take ease on our goals and commitments. And I think as an outcome from this, we understand that definitely developing nations struggle a little bit more, but there's a lot of opportunities for collaboration.
Yeah, I think a lot of studies show that making this transition to away from fossil fuels and to a 100% renewable energy future is actually quite good for business. I mean, it will create a lot of jobs, and it will also reduce a lot of costs from, for example, pollution. Air pollution kills about 8 million people a year. And then you have all the environmental destruction as well. So once you factor all those things in, which is not being factored into our current energy prices, then there's actually a good business case. From a pure sort of business case point of view, you can make that point. And then, of course, on top of that, we also want to live a livable Earth to our children and future generations. So that's another good reason, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely.
Yeah. I think maybe another thing, like you mentioned, that we didn't talk about is carbon tax. Because currently it's not a level playing field for all the energy sources. So we need to actually have a carbon tax to allow people to make a conscious choice on what they want to use for their energy usage, right, in the electricity mix.
Definitely. Okay, great. Thank you very much. In our next episode, we will talk about Malaysia's renewable energy target and policies and how this relates to the overall GHG emissions reduction plan. Thank you all very much for your time, and you can stay tuned to IEN news and updates by joining our LinkedIn page or visiting our website. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I